For 17 years, a ghost moved through the Middle East. He appeared in Damascus, vanished into Baghdad, resurfaced in Beirut, and disappeared again before anyone could confirm he had ever been there at all. His movements were erratic, his security protocols legendary, his operational discipline nearly flawless. And in the windowless analysis rooms of Tel Aviv, a team of intelligence officers studied every fragment of information about him with the obsessive focus of archaeologists examining ancient texts. They knew that somewhere in the patterns of his life, buried beneath layers of deception and misdirection, was a signature, a rhythm that could be exploited, because everyone, no matter how careful, leaves a trail. The question was whether they could read it before it was too late. Qasem Soleimani was not like other targets. He was not a terrorist hiding in compounds or a bureaucrat vulnerable to blackmail. He was a military commander, a strategist, and perhaps most dangerously, a man who understood intelligence work as well as those hunting him. He had survived assassination attempts, avoided drone strikes, and evaded capture in some of the most surveilled conflict zones on Earth. His movements were protected by layers of security that had been refined over decades, and his network stretched across borders in ways that made traditional targeting nearly impossible. For Mossad and the coalition of intelligence services tracking him, this was not a manhunt in any conventional sense. It was something closer to a chess match played across years, where every move had to be calculated not just for immediate effect, but for how it would shape the opponent's thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead. The hunt did not begin with a decision to kill him. It began with a decision to understand him. In intelligence work, understanding precedes action. You cannot neutralize what you cannot predict, and you cannot predict what you do not understand. So the first phase of the operation was not operational at all. It was analytical. Teams were assembled not to plan strikes, but to construct a psychological profile so detailed that it could anticipate decisions before Soleimani himself made them. What were his priorities? What risks would he accept and which would he avoid? How did he communicate? Who did he trust? What patterns emerged when those patterns were examined not day by day but year by year? Intelligence is often described as a mosaic, thousands of small pieces that mean nothing individually, but reveal a picture when assembled. But in this case, the mosaic was four-dimensional, changing across time, adapting to circumstances, responding to pressure in ways that had to be mapped like weather systems or market fluctuations. One of the fundamental challenges in hunting a high-value target is that the target knows he is being hunted. Soleimani was not naive. He understood that every phone call could be intercepted, every vehicle tracked, every meeting compromised. His response was not to go silent, but to flood the system with noise. He used decoys, false itineraries, and compartmentalized communications. He traveled in convoys that split and reconverged, stayed in locations that were changed at the last moment, and maintained a schedule that appeared deliberately random. For years, intelligence services monitored him, collected data, and came up empty. Not because they lacked the technology or the resources, but because the data itself was designed to mislead. He was not hiding from surveillance. He was performing for it, creating a version of himself that could be tracked while his real movements remained invisible. But deception, no matter how sophisticated, requires consistency. And consistency, over time, creates patterns. This is the paradox that every intelligence officer exploits and every target fears. You cannot operate effectively without some degree of predictability, and you cannot remain unpredictable without sacrificing operational effectiveness. Soleimani's challenge was that he could not simply vanish. He had a war to fight, proxies to coordinate, commanders to meet, and strategic objectives to advance, which meant that somewhere beneath the noise, there had to be signal. The question was whether the analysts could separate one from the other before the opportunity passed. By the mid-2010s, the intelligence picture was becoming clearer, not because Soleimani had become careless, but because the volume of data, had reached a threshold where statistical analysis could begin to identify anomalies. When did he travel? When did he not travel? Which cities appeared in reports more frequently than others? Which associates were seen repeatedly despite apparent efforts to avoid patterns? The work was painstaking, the progress measured in months and years rather than days. But slowly, a model began to emerge. A probabilistic framework that could not predict his exact location, but could narrow the possibilities, reduce the uncertainty, and create windows of opportunity where none had existed before. What makes this hunt particularly instructive from an intelligence perspective is that it was never about a single breakthrough. There was no intercepted phone call that revealed his location, no betrayal by a trusted lieutenant, no dramatic intelligence coup. Instead, it was the accumulation of marginal gains, the slow refinement of understanding, the patient construction of a predictive model that became incrementally more accurate with each new data point. This is how modern intelligence work actually functions. Not through Hollywood moments of revelation, but through disciplined analysis applied over time, until the picture resolves from static into clarity. And yet, even as the picture clarified, the operational challenge remained immense. Knowing where someone might be and being able to act on that knowledge are entirely different problems. Soleimani moved through territories where Western intelligence had limited access, where local networks were loyal to him, and where any overt action would trigger responses that could escalate into regional conflict. The analysts could build their models, refine their predictions, and narrow the windows of opportunity. But the decision to act was not theirs to make. That decision belonged to policymakers who had to weigh intelligence against geopolitics, operational feasibility against strategic risk, and the value of eliminating one man against the consequences of how that elimination would be achieved. Throughout 2018 and 2019, the tracking intensified. New sources were cultivated, new technologies deployed, new partnerships formed with intelligence services that had their own reasons for wanting Soleimani contained. The model was tested, refined, tested again. False positives were analyzed to understand why they had occurred. Near misses were dissected to determine what had gone wrong. And through it all, Soleimani continued to move, continued to operate, continued to evade the systems designed to pin him down. There were moments when the intelligence suggested he was vulnerable. Moments when operations were planned and then called off because the certainty was not high enough. The risk too great, the window too narrow. The patterns, once established, are difficult to break. And by late 2019, after years of observation, after countless hours of analysis, after the construction and reconstruction of models that mapped not just his movements, but his thinking, the intelligence community had something it had never had before. Not certainty, because intelligence work never offers certainty, but something close enough. A convergence of factors, alignment of possibilities, a moment where the years of patient observation suggested that the ghost might finally become tangible. The question was no longer whether he could be found. The question was whether the decision would be made to act on what had been found, and what would happen when the decision was finally made. The challenge with high-value targets who survive for decades is that their survival breeds a particular kind of arrogance, not the reckless kind, but something more subtle and more dangerous. It is the confidence that comes from having evaded death so many times that the threat begins to feel theoretical. Soleimani had operated in war zones for most of his adult life. He had been targeted before, survived ambushes, walked away from airstrikes that killed those around him, and each survival reinforced a belief system that blended operational discipline with something closer to fatalism. He believed in his mission, believed in his cause, and perhaps most critically for those tracking him, believed that his presence was essential to that cause. This was not vanity, it was conviction. And conviction, in intelligence terms, creates obligation. Obligation creates movement, and movement, eventually, creates vulnerability. By early 2019, The analytical model had reached a level of sophistication that surprised even those who had built it. What had begun as scattered data points, fragmentary sightings, and intercepted communications that led nowhere had evolved into something resembling a predictive framework. Not a crystal ball, nothing so precise, but a probabilistic map that could identify when conditions were aligning for his presence in certain locations. The key breakthrough was not technological, it was psychological. The analysts had stopped trying to track where Soleimani was at any given moment, and had instead focused on understanding why he moved. What operational pressures required his physical presence? Which proxy commanders needed direct guidance? Which strategic decisions could not be delegated? When you cannot track a ghost, you track the circumstances that force the ghost to materialize. But intelligence collection, no matter how refined, is only half the equation. The other half is interpretation, and interpretation is where doubt lives. Every intelligence service that has ever existed has struggled with the same fundamental problem. How much certainty is enough to act? Too little certainty, and you waste resources. Compromise operations, or worse, trigger consequences you cannot control. Too much certainty and the window closes. The target adapts, the opportunity vanishes. In the case of Soleimani, this tension was magnified by the stakes. He was not just a military commander. He was a symbol, a figure whose elimination would send shockwaves through the region in ways that could not be fully anticipated, which meant that every assessment had to be weighed not just for accuracy, but for consequence. And consequence, by definition, exists in the future, beyond the reach of intelligence work. Throughout 2019, there were windows, moments when the intelligence suggested he would be in a particular city, attending a particular meeting, traveling a particular route. Operations were planned, assets positioned, authorizations requested, and then, in most cases, called off. Sometimes because the intelligence proved wrong. Sometimes because the operational risk was deemed high. Sometimes because the geopolitical moment was judged inappropriate. This is the reality of intelligence work that rarely makes it into public narratives. For every operation that proceeds, there are dozens that do not because of failure, but because of restraint. The discipline to not act is often more important than the capability to act. And in the hunt for Soleimani, the discipline was tested repeatedly. What changed in late 2019 was not a single piece of intelligence, but a shift in context. The regional situation had evolved in ways that made his physical presence more necessary, more frequent, and therefore more predictable. Proxy forces were under pressure. Strategic objectives were at risk. The kind of coordination he specialized in could not be conducted remotely. Not with the stakes involved, not with the mistrust inherent in proxy relationships. He had to be present. He had to show himself. And the analysts tracking him recognized the shift not because they intercepted a specific order, but because they understood the operational logic that would compel such movement. This is the essence of predictive intelligence, not knowing what someone will do, but understanding the circumstances that make certain actions inevitable. Still, knowing that movement is likely and knowing when and where the movement will occur are different problems entirely. Soleimani's security protocols remained formidable. His travel patterns, even when necessity demanded them, were designed to minimize exposure. He used multiple routes, changed plans at the last moment, and maintained operational security that would have been impressive for someone far less experienced. The intelligence services tracking him had to account for this, had to build their assessments not around certainty, but around probability distributions that could shift with new information. They were not tracking a target. They were tracking a set of possibilities that occasionally converged into something actionable. The psychological dimension of the hunt also shifted during this period. For the analysts who had spent years studying him, Soleimani had become more than a target. He had become a problem to be solved, a puzzle whose solution required understanding not just his tactics but his thinking. What did he value? What would he risk? What mistakes would his confidence allow him to make? Intelligence work at this level becomes almost intimate, not in any personal sense, but in the depth of understanding required. You begin to see the world through the target's eyes, to anticipate decisions based on how he would weigh options, to recognize vulnerabilities that emerge not from carelessness, but from the internal logic of his own strategic thinking. And then there were the debates within intelligence agencies, between analysts and operators, between those who assessed risk and those who would bear the consequences of miscalculation. Was the intelligence solid enough? Were the operational conditions favorable? What would the response be? What would the second-order effects look like? Intelligence provides information, but it does not make decisions. Those decisions belong to policymakers, and policymakers operate in a world where intelligence is only one input among many. The fact that something can be done does not mean it should be done, and the difference between those two statements is where intelligence ends and policy begins. By December 2019, the model indicated increasing probability of movement. Not certainty, never certainty, but enough of a pattern that operational planning intensified. Assets were alerted, surveillance resources were repositioned, communication channels were prepared. The machinery of intelligence work, which had been running in the background for years, moved into a higher state of readiness. But readiness is not action, and the gap between the two remained. Because even at this stage, even with years of preparation and refinement, the fundamental uncertainty remained. Would he move as predicted? Would the window be wide enough? Would the authorization come? And most critically, what would happen afterward? Intelligence officers are trained to think in probabilities, but they also understand that low probability events happen with surprising regularity. The question was not whether the model could predict his movements with perfect accuracy. The question was whether it could predict them well enough, and whether the threshold of confidence would align with a moment when action was both possible and authorized. As 2019 turned into 2020, that alignment seemed closer than it had ever been. Not guaranteed, not certain, but close enough that those who had spent years building the hunt could feel the possibility, shifting from theoretical to operational. The ghost was still moving, still evading, still confident in his ability to remain untouchable. But the systems tracking him had evolved, the understanding had deepened, and the patience that had defined the hunt for so long was approaching a moment where patience might finally yield to action. The transition from intelligence collection to operational decision-making is where most hunts either succeed or collapse under their own weight. By early January 2020, the analysts tracking Soleimani were no longer asking whether they could predict his movements with sufficient accuracy. They were asking whether that accuracy justified the risk of acting on it. This is the moment in every intelligence operation where the comfort of observation ends and the burden of consequence begins. Because observation carries no cost beyond resources and time, but action carries everything. It carries exposure, escalation, political fallout, and the possibility that the intelligence, no matter how carefully constructed, might simply be wrong. And in this case, being wrong meant not just a failed operation, but potentially a regional conflict whose dimensions could not be controlled. What the analysts understood, and what the decision-makers had to grapple with, was that Soleimani's pattern of movement had shifted in a way that created both opportunity and urgency. The regional dynamics that had made his physical presence more necessary were not theoretical projections. They were real, observable, and accelerating. Proxy networks were under strain. Strategic positions were being contested. The kind of high-level coordination that defined his role could not be sustained through intermediaries alone, not with the stakes involved, not with the level of mistrust that existed even among allied forces. He had to be visible. He had to engage directly, and that visibility, the necessity, was precisely what made him vulnerable. But it also meant that the window for action was not indefinite. Once the immediate strategic pressures resolved, Once the need for his direct involvement diminished, the patterns would shift again, and the years of work building toward this moment would have to begin anew. Within the intelligence community, the debate intensified. Some argued that the model was as good as it would ever be, that waiting for greater certainty was waiting for something that would never arrive, that intelligence work is always probabilistic, and the goal is not perfection, but sufficiency. Others cautioned that the consequences of miscalculation were so severe that even high confidence was not high enough, that the operational environment remained unpredictable, that acting prematurely could trigger responses that would outweigh whatever tactical advantage his elimination provided. These were not abstract philosophical disagreements. They were assessments grounded in experience, informed by previous operations that had succeeded or failed. Based on exactly these kinds of judgment calls, and everyone involved understood that whatever decision was made, it would be judged not by the quality of the intelligence at the time, but by the outcome that followed. The psychological pressure of this phase is difficult to overstate. Intelligence officers are trained to manage uncertainty, to work within ambiguity, to make assessments based on incomplete information. But there is a difference between chronic uncertainty and the acute pressure of knowing that a decision point is approaching, that the luxury of waiting for more information is evaporating, that action or inaction will both carry irreversible consequences. For those who had spent years building the hunt, who had refined the models and tracked the patterns, and constructed the predictive frameworks, there was a natural inclination to believe that the work was ready, that the moment had arrived. But institutional memory cautioned against that inclination. History is full of intelligence operations that failed not because the analysis was wrong, but because the confidence in that analysis exceeded what the evidence could support, and yet the intelligence continued to narrow, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the steady accumulation of indicators that aligned with the Model S predictions. Communications intercepts suggested coordination efforts consistent with high-level meetings. Movement patterns of associated figures indicated preparation for engagements that would require senior leadership. The operational tempo in the region reflected decisions that bore a strategic signature. None of this constituted proof, but collectively it created a picture that was increasingly difficult to interpret any other way. The question was no longer whether the intelligence pointed toward his presence in certain locations at certain times. The question was whether that intelligence was being shaped, consciously or unconsciously, by the desire for it to point in that direction. This is the trap that every intelligence operation must guard against. When you spend years building a model, when you invest enormous resources in tracking a target, when the pressure to produce results intensifies, there is a natural cognitive bias toward interpreting ambiguous information in ways that support action, not because analysts are dishonest, but because the human mind seeks resolution, seeks closure, seeks validation that the effort has not been wasted. The discipline required to resist the bias, to maintain skepticism, even toward your own conclusions, to question whether the pattern you see is real, or merely the pattern you have trained yourself. To recognize that discipline is what separates good intelligence work from catastrophic miscalculation. And in January 2020, that discipline was being tested in ways that made everyone involved acutely aware of how fine the line was between confidence and overconfidence. The geopolitical context added another layer of complexity. The regional situation was volatile in ways that made timing critical. Windows of opportunity in intelligence work are rarely static. They open and close based on factors far beyond the target's movements. Political authorization, operational feasibility, diplomatic considerations. All of these shift constantly, creating moments where action is possible and moments where it is not, regardless of what the intelligence indicates. For the planners coordinating the hunt, this meant that even if the intelligence was perfect, even if Soleimani's location could be pinpointed with absolute certainty, that certainty meant nothing without the convergence of all the other factors required to act. And convergence, by its nature, is rare and fleeting. By mid-January, The intelligence picture had crystallized to a point where operational planning moved from theoretical to concrete, not because certainty had been achieved, but because the threshold of acceptable risk had been reached or perhaps exceeded. The model indicated high probability of movement to specific locations within a defined time frame. The operational environment appeared favorable, at least as favorable as it was likely to become. The strategic calculus, weighed by those far above the intelligence analysts, had shifted toward action. But even at this stage, even with authorization pending and assets positioned, the fundamental uncertainty remained. Would he move as predicted? Would the operational window remain open long enough? Would the intelligence hold under the stress of real-world variables that no model could fully account for? What makes this phase of the hunt so instructive is that it reveals the essential paradox of intelligence work at the highest levels. You gather information to reduce uncertainty, but uncertainty can never be eliminated. You build models to predict behavior, but behavior is never perfectly predictable. You refine your assessments to increase confidence, but confidence itself can become a liability if it blinds you to what you cannot see. The analysts and operators preparing for action understood all of this. They understood that they were working with probabilities, not certainties, with informed judgments rather than guaranteed outcomes. But they also understood that at some point, analysis has to yield a decision. That the purpose of intelligence is not to achieve perfect knowledge, but to enable action in the absence of perfect knowledge. As January 2020 progressed, the machinery of the hunt reached its final configuration. Years of observation, months of intensified tracking, weeks of operational preparation, all converging toward a moment that might last only minutes or might not materialize at all. The ghost was still moving, still confident, still operating under the assumption that the systems tracking him were too slow, too bureaucratic, too constrained by their own procedures to catch him. He had evaded death for so long that perhaps he had stopped believing it could reach him. Or perhaps he simply believed that his mission mattered more than his survival. That the risk was acceptable because the cause demanded it. Either way, the convergence was approaching. The moment where years of patient intelligence work would either validate itself or reveal its limitations in the most consequential way possible. On January 3, 2020, the convergence happened. Not as a surprise, not as a sudden opportunity seized in chaos, but as the culmination of years of observation, months of narrowing possibilities, and weeks of operational preparation that had positioned resources in a way that could respond when the moment arrived. The intelligence had predicted movement. The movement occurred, and in the space between prediction and confirmation, the decision was made. What followed was not the beginning of the story, but its end. The moment when years of patient intelligence work translated into irreversible action. The ghost became tangible, and then the ghost was gone. But the end of a hunt is never truly an ending. It is a transformation, a shift from one kind of uncertainty to another. Before the operation, the uncertainty was whether the intelligence was accurate, whether the timing was right, whether the consequences could be managed. After the operation, the uncertainty was what those consequences would actually be, how the region would respond, what strategic voids would open, and whether the elimination of one figure would change anything fundamental, or merely accelerate dynamics that were already in motion. Intelligence agencies can predict movements, can model behaviors, can assess probabilities with increasing precision, but they cannot predict history. They cannot model how symbols transform after death, how martyrdom reshapes narratives, or how the removal of one node in a network forces the network to adapt in ways that may be more dangerous than what existed before. The immediate aftermath was not silence, but noise. Condemnations, threats, retaliation, escalation cycles that intelligence analysts had anticipated but could not fully control. The hunt had succeeded in its tactical objective, but tactical success and strategic success are not the same thing. Soleimani's death did not end the networks he had built. It did not eliminate the proxy forces he had coordinated. It did not resolve the underlying conflicts that had made his role so central. What it did was remove a particular kind of coordination, a particular set of relationships, and a particular strategic mind from the equation. Whether their removal made the region more stable or less stable, safer or more dangerous, those questions would take years to answer. And the answers would depend on factors far beyond the intelligence operation itself. For those who had spent years building the hunt, the conclusion brought not celebration, but reflection. Intelligence work is often thankless in success and devastating in failure. But the emotional weight of irreversible action is something that stays with those involved, regardless of outcome. They had studied this man for so long, understood his thinking so deeply, tracked his movements with such obsessive focus that his elimination felt less like victory and more like the closing of a chapter that had defined much of their professional lives. What would they track now? What patterns would they study? What ghost would replace the one they had finally caught? Because the nature of intelligence work is that it never ends. Targets are eliminated, operations conclude, but the larger conflicts continue and new threats emerge to fill whatever vacuum has been created. The question of whether the hunt was worth it, whether the years of effort and the resources invested and the risks taken justified the outcome, the question cannot be answered by intelligence agencies alone. They provided the capability. They built the understanding. They created the conditions where action became possible. But the decision to act and the responsibility for what followed belonged to policymakers who had to weigh intelligence against geopolitics, tactical advantage against strategic consequence, immediate objectives against long-term stability. Intelligence informs decisions. It does not make them. And the gap between those two functions is where accountability lies, and where history ultimately judges not just the operation, but the wisdom of having pursued it in the first place. What remains instructive about the Soleimani hunt, beyond the operational details that will remain classified for decades, is what it reveals about the nature of modern intelligence work. It was not a story of sudden breakthroughs or dramatic revelations. It was a story of patience, of incremental understanding, of models refined over years until they could predict behavior with sufficient accuracy to enable action. It was a story of restraint, of windows that opened and closed without being exploited because the certainty was not high enough or the timing was not right. It was a story of psychological profiling, of understanding not just where someone is but why they move, what compels them, what makes them predictable even when they believe they are not. And it was a story of consequence, of recognizing that eliminating a target is only the beginning of a much longer process, whose outcomes cannot be controlled. The hunt also revealed the limits of intelligence. For all the sophistication, all the technology, all the analytical frameworks and predictive models, the fundamental uncertainty remained until the very end. Was the intelligence correct? Would the operation succeed? What would happen afterward? These questions could be assessed, probabilities assigned, risks evaluated, but certainty remained elusive. Intelligence work operates in the space between knowledge and ignorance, trying to push the boundary toward knowledge while acknowledging that the boundary can never be fully crossed. And in that space, decisions are made that carry consequences far beyond what any intelligence assessment can capture. Years later, the regional dynamics continue to evolve in ways that make simple judgments about success or failure impossible. Some networks weakened, others adapted and grew stronger. New commanders emerged with different styles and different priorities. The symbolic weight of Soleimani's death shifted the narrative in ways that benefited some actors and harmed others. Whether the world is better or worse for his elimination depends entirely on which metrics you use, which time frame you examine, and which perspective you adopt. Intelligence agencies measure success in operational terms. Was the target eliminated? Was the operation executed as planned? Were the immediate objectives achieved? But history measures success differently, and history's judgment is still being written. What can be said with certainty is that the hunt itself was a master class in how modern intelligence pursuits function when the target is sophisticated, when the stakes are enormous, and when failure carries consequences that extend far beyond the operation itself. It demonstrated that patience is often more important than speed, that understanding is more valuable than action, and that the discipline to wait for the right moment matters more than the capability to act at any moment. It showed that intelligence work at the highest levels is as much psychology as technology, as much about reading human behavior as intercepting communications. And it proved that even the most disciplined targets, even those who have survived for decades, eventually create patterns that can be exploited if the hunters are patient enough and skilled enough to recognize them. The ghost is gone, but the shadows remain, and in those shadows, other hunts continue, other targets move, other intelligence services track patterns and build models and wait for moments of convergence that may take years to arrive. This is the world that exists behind the headlines, beneath the public narratives, in the spaces where power operates not through spectacle but through silence. It is a world where success is often invisible, where the most important operations are never acknowledged, and where the work continues long after any single hunt concludes. The Soleimani operation was not an aberration. It was a window into how these systems function, how patience and discipline and analytical rigor can create outcomes that appear sudden, but are actually the result of years of invisible work. And if you found this analysis valuable, if you want to understand more about how intelligence agencies operate in the shadows, how strategic patience shapes outcomes, and how the invisible machinery of power functions in ways the public rarely sees, then this is only the beginning. There are other hunts, other operations, other intelligence rivalries playing out right now in ways we can only begin to understand. Subscribe to continue exploring these unseen battles. Watch the next episode on the covert intelligence war reshaping the Middle East. And remember that what you see in the news is never the whole story. The real story happens in the silence and the years of work that precede the moments that make headlines, and the patience of those who understand that power at its highest levels is exercised not through force but through understanding. The hunt is over, but the work never ends.